So way before Chris Evans ever strapped on the shield, before Marvel was Marvel, Captain America was a 1940s comic book by writer Joe Simon and artist Jack Kirby. Conceived originally as pure propaganda for the United States during the days of World War II, the character Steve Rogers was everything Simon and Kirby thought an American soldier should be. Selfless, strong, courageous, and his story inspired countless young men to enlist in the armed forces, quickly becoming one of the most popular superheroes of all time. But he wasn't the creative duo's first shot at a patriotic protector. You might not know it, but just a few months before Cap was crafted, Simon and Kirby were freelancers working for a publisher called Novelty Press, and were tasked with producing an action hero to headline a comic book targeted to young boys. Together, they dreamed up a prototypical super soldier by the name of Blue Bolt. First published in June of 1940, Blue Bolt Comics was one of the earliest publications to be titled after a specific character that appeared in its pages. This seems obvious now, but the industry standard at the time was to release a themed or genre comic book, with each issue acting as sort of an anthology. So you'd see titles like Detective Comics, containing mystery stories. But at least through the 1930s, it was rare for a particular character to become popular enough to always headline. These stories were, after all, disposable. Publishers wanted the freedom to trade out characters based on who was hot or not during any given month. But when the likes of Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman started becoming household names toward the end of the decade, Novelty felt piggybacking off the success of one beloved character would be the new way to go. Enter Blue Bolt. Writer Joe Simon threw together a story for what Novelty hoped would be an eye-catching character, and he quickly asked Kirby to hop on board and help flesh out the first year of the series. It's important to keep in mind that Blue Bolt was meant more as a mascot than anything. The idea was get your Superman-type character embedded enough into the cultural zeitgeist that the other stories in the book could always piggyback off the fame. Did it work? No. I mean, who are you more familiar with today? The Man of Steel or the human lightning streak? Blue Bolt Comics lasted over 10 years for a total of 101 issues, and the entire thing is a bizarre ride of broken promises and creative mismanagement, which I have now distilled into this handy-dandy video. Let's start with issue number 1, where we're introduced to the series' main character, Fred Parrish, a star football player at Harvard. One afternoon, he's hanging out in a remote mountain region practicing punting with a couple of his buddies when a freak storm rips through the area, killing everyone but him. He manages to reach his small private plane for cover and has the totally genius idea to fire it up and try to fly out of the storm instead of just, waiting the whole thing out. As he takes to the air, lightning strikes his plane, enters his body, the aircraft crashes, and we discover that the storm was caused by a sort of mad scientist named Dr. Berthoff. The doctor visits the wreckage and, finding Fred alive, takes him to his secret underground lab and uses his electrified body in a radium experiment to create the Blue Bolt, a superhuman with the power of lightning, giving the resurrected Fred the power to fly, shoot lightning from his eyes, and he equips him with a powerful lightning gun that can stun enemies. As you can maybe tell from the goofy-looking costume, he's meant to play the role of a Roman centurion type, because as our hero soon discovers, underneath the earth is an entire quasi-medieval world in which two warring kingdoms fight for supremacy. Dr. Berthoff's Science Kingdom against the evil Green Magic Kingdom, led by the tantalizing Green Sorceress. Berthoff enlists Fred in the fight, and over the course of the first year's publication, readers were treated to a wacky comic series that attempts to combine the excitement of sci-fi with the tropes of classical fantasy stories, and it's all really rough. So each of the first 11 issues follows basically the same formula. The episode starts with Berthoff showing off some wacky new invention. The Green Forces then attack, Blue Bolt fights back, loses, and then gets sent to the Green Sorceress to be tortured. Once together, the Green Sorceress is infatuated by him, allowing Blue Bolt to gain the upper hand. The Sorceress's life then usually falls into peril, and being the hero that he is, Blue Bolt rescues her with the help of whatever it was that Bertov invented. There are tiny tweaks made here and there to this routine, but for the most part, that's basically each episode. The common thread being the will they won't they romantic tension between Bolt and the Sorceress. Novelty rolled out these first issues with high expectations, but very quickly discovered that their young audience was less than enthused. To put it bluntly, folks felt that Blue Bolt stunk. The series' world building was confusing. The entire time that you're reading it, you remain totally uncertain about the level of technology that each side has. Bolt's special powers rubber band from being far too weak to far too powerful, sometimes within the exact same issue, and that romantic tension between Bolt and the Sorceress rang totally hollow and became quite repetitive. But most of all, it's important to remember that the United States was on the cusp of joining World War II. Readers wanted contemporary action stories that featured the modern military. Blue Bolt's fantasy setting seemed to be the wrong aesthetic for the wrong time. However, one of the other character stories featured in the Blue Bolt comic anthology was clicking with readers. Besides titles like Edison Bell, Sub-Zero Man, and Phantom Sub, Blue Bolt comics also featured the story of Dick Cole, a young and heroic cadet at the fictional Far Military Academy. The Wonder Boy was placed right after Blue Bolt in the anthology's lineup, and when the audience found themselves clicking with the comic book's second story more than the first, the publication's editors knew they had a big problem on their hands. After all, the whole point of titling the magazine Blue Bolt Comics was to push one particular hero as the face of the company, but Cole very quickly became the bigger name. It turns out a story about a young man training as a military recruit was far more relatable to a young male 1940s audience than a magical guy in a goofy-looking costume. Novelty also had another problem. Simon and Kirby wanted to move off the project as their contracts were expiring, and they had ideas for a revamped superhero focused on the war effort over at Timely Comics. Knowing this, Novelty overhauled Blue Bolt's writing staff, concluded the Green Kingdom saga, and starting in issue 12, refocused the story by introducing Fred Parrish's brother Kip, who was, you guessed it, a military cadet. For the next 6 issues, Blue Bolt heads back to the surface to watch over his brother and aid in the growing war effort. Interestingly enough, during this era, the enemy of the state is never outright named. There are vague references to the Reds, but that's about it. Meanwhile, Dick Cole was continuing to explode in popularity, and Novelty eventually decided to place him on the cover. Though due to contracts, trademarks, and copyrights, the magazine still had to be called Blue Bolt Comics, and they tried to circumvent this by ensuring Dick Cole got a featured listing, always placed at a higher billing. Subtle. The Kip arc concludes with Fred finally cluing his brother in on the underground world, as well as his secret identity, before reclaiming his American citizenry and volunteering for the military himself. From this point forward, Blue Bolt the Human Lightning Streak was rebranded as Blue Bolt the American, and one begins to wonder if Novelty was cheekily trying to co-opt Simon and Kirby's retooled Captain America concept. The next 11 issues then represent the company's attempt to strike a balance between the two story styles, the original fantasy arc and the modern war pivot, by introducing the character of Lois Blake, a young woman that Bolt rescues on the surface and then takes a liking to, so much so that he brings her back to the underground world, and before we know it, Bertov agrees to give her lightning powers as well, and Blue Bolt suddenly finds himself with a trusty sidekick. This appears to be a last-minute response to the explosion in sidekick characters that had happened in the comic book world just a year earlier, and is a great illustration of how the Blue Bolt series seemed to be perpetually behind the rest of the industry. There is an admittedly entertaining run of issues where the Green Sorceress returns to the series and, finding her beloved Bolt bound to another lady, sets out to win him back by brute violence. These are some of the more tongue-in-cheek episodes. In fact, one memorable issue is literally a meta slapstick comedy in which the heroes are chased around the page layouts, everybody seemingly fully aware that they are characters in a comic book. These quirky entries, they don't last long. Starting in the August 1942 issue, new writers and artists were brought in, and the Blue Bolt series series was again completely overhauled. And boy, oh boy, is this total creative transformation utterly jarring. One month you're reading a goofy slapstick, and then the next month, bam, it's a gritty war story. For the first time ever, the Nazis are named as the enemies of the state, and Blue Bolt is immediately thrust into World War II. After hearing on a radio broadcast about a Nazi attack on American soil, Lois and Fred bid Dr. Bertov farewell and leave the underground world to return to the surface and aid in the war effort. The two find themselves in the middle of a fictional New York City bombing, and having ditched their costumes, leap into action and rescue the wounded. Bolt manages to get to a fighter plane, takes to the skies, brings down a massive Nazi airship, and when the wreckage clears, the pair enlists in the army and go their separate ways to fight for America. If all this seems to happen totally out of nowhere, you should remember that behind the scenes, Novelty Press was desperately trying to figure out how to get people to read the Blue Bolt story, because at this point, Dick Cole had become far and away the favorite of the publication, with young readers even requesting that they just straight up drop certain series and add additional Dick Cole episodes. The company, they couldn't keep up with the added demand for this title, and they were still stubbornly trying to save the marquee name. In the real world, by this point, Pearl Harbor had happened, the United States had officially entered into World War II, and the entire country was on high alert. Patriotism was at an all-time high, and as young men were being drafted into the armed forces, these were the kinds of stories that were selling. So, all at once, Blue Bolt the superhero had to become Blue Bolt the American fighter pilot. And this pivot totally changed the series, as in they threw out everything that came before it. The underground world, Dr. Bertov, the Green Sorceress, even Bolt's superpowers are never mentioned in the story again. If you were a fan, you might as well have forgotten everything about the series' continuity up to this point, because it all goes out the window. Novelty threw new writers into reimagining the series, and they seem to have no knowledge of what came before. Like, they don't even get the main character's name right. They treat Blue Bolt like it's his legal name, except for a weird one-off issue where he revisits his home and his family and friends call him Fred Bolt. You figure it out. I sometimes wonder what fans of the July issue thought when they opened up Blue Bolt's story in August and saw a totally different series. All of these installments, they have their own formula. Bolt is sent on a mission, has his plane shot down, completes the mission on foot, then commandeers an enemy plane and wins a final aerial dogfight before returning back to base. I must admit to you that I despise most of these particular comics, given that anti-Japanese sentiment was at an all-time high in the United States. Many of these comics are incredibly racist, featuring ugly stereotypes and hurtful caricatures that were products of their time, and sadly, quite common throughout the entire comics industry, even present in stories featuring still popular superheroes. I don't want to focus too much on this particular part of Blue Bolt Comics history, other than to simply state that all such depictions of various races and peoples were, of course, wrong, but they do need to be mentioned and brought up because it helps us to honestly contextualize the content of the publication. Because of the war effort, America had major supply chain issues, and because paper, like almost everything, was being rationed, comic books needed to become smaller. Blue Bolt Comics would occasionally have to adjust their story length to compensate for this, but their main contribution to the US was, to put it bluntly, publishing propaganda. Most comic books around this time period had characters that enlisted in the army, and readers of Blue Bolt comics were routinely encouraged to purchase war bonds whenever possible. For the next 19 months, the Blue Bolt series consisted of the title character working his way through the ranks to become one of the most celebrated pilots in the military. Then there's an extended arc where Bolt is assigned a co-pilot gunner named Charlie, who acts mostly as comic relief. And the story also introduces Marge Heslin, a reporter and photographer. As you can imagine, she exists mainly to get kidnapped and to be rescued by Bolt and Charlie by the end of each issue. These stories are all kind of samey, but the real interest comes from reading the editors section of the magazines. Novelty eventually began publishing letters to the editors in which they would allow young readers to give them feedback. Most of these suggestions include make more Dick Cole comics. Readers openly wrote that other stories were boring. Blue Bolt was lame. It's funny to read through these. The editors are so desperate to figure out how to get readers to like the Blue Bolt character that at one point they basically just straight up are like, tell us what you kids want.
You kids don't know what you want. Just tell me what's wrong with the show!
They are totally lost as to what the story direction should even be, and at this point sales of the magazine seem to be on the steep decline. Evidently, growing concern over violence in comic books was starting to become a big problem, and when the war started winding down, Novelty needed to find a new direction for the character. So, by the May 1946 issue, Bolt is honorably discharged, and the violent war missions look to be at an end. Needing work, the character becomes a pilot for a picture magazine and is assigned to a quirky photographer named Snap Doodle. With Marge now his competition, the storylines follow a new formula. Bolt and Snap are assigned to oddball, weird news stories, and each issue race to get the scoop before Marge does. Along the way, inevitably, Snap or Marge fall into trouble, and Bolt must leap into action to rescue them. This formula was maintained for about 30-odd months, occasionally broken up by feel-good one-offs where Bolt would return to his hometown of Portville for the holidays. One story involves him risking his pilot's license to deliver penicillin to a dying boy. In another one, he becomes a high school baseball coach to save his old school's losing season. The hope was that with more uplifting stories away from the front lines, more readers would then hop back on board. But despite Novelty's best efforts, numbers didn't improve. At this point, it's kind of like watching a sinking ship. Even the editorial section is full of musings on how to save the Blue Bolt character, and even the entire Blue Bolt comics publication. Finally, after years and years of demand, in Blue Bolt Comics' January 1949 issue, Novelty Press announces that Dick Cole is getting his own standalone magazine. But by this point, nobody cared. As the spin-off title launched, Blue Bolt's anthology just became an unmitigated disaster. Most of the stories in the comics at this time period are laughably bad. Budgets have clearly been cut, leading to shorter page counts. The magazine started publishing bi-monthly, and I just kind of got the feeling that things were starting to wind down to a finish. There's even this super bizarre and dumb episode where they completely retcon Blue Bolt's origin story, making him one part of a Two Brothers circus sideshow. It is so stupid.
It's so dumb.
Despite the March-April issue of that year, including a quasi-apology from the editorial staff about the declining quality of the comic with a resolution to do better moving forward, things got even worse. We know today that behind the scenes, Novelty was nearly bankrupt. Sales from their publications, even the new Dick Cole comic, were not enough to cover costs, and with comic books themselves quickly falling out of favor with the general public, the company quietly began selling off their assets to get out of the business entirely. Things were so bad that for the first time, an issue was published without a Blue Bolt story. Novelty had to make the rest of the year's publication dates due to contracts, but they only had a few finished episodes left, having fired all of the production teams. So they tried to space things out by putting Blue Bolt in every other installment. Issue 99 then features a fairly solid episode, but for the 100th issue of Blue Bolt Comics, he's not even in it. Several readers begin writing in to complain that recent comic books have been absolutely terrible, with most of the popular titles having been completely removed, and what many thought should have been a celebratory centennial edition is instead a half-baked magazine featuring next to no stories and tons of ads. Issue 101 ends the final arc of the franchise with Bolt offering a ring to Marge, hinting at a possible engagement. This this was the final story drawn. But it wasn't quite the end for our hero. Novelty Press finally found a buyer for most of their assets in one L.B. Cole, who was actually the publication's cover artist. After purchasing the Blue Bolt comic moniker, along with the rights to the Blue Bolt character, L.B. began selling reprints of the old comics, masquerading as new editions by simply drawing up new covers for the publication. Hey, give the guy credit, he stuck with what he knew. After a handful of these hit shelves, L.B. decided to rebrand the comic from Blue Bolt to Weird Fantastic Stories of the Unknown, on a hunch that the popularity of oddball weirdo comics might make a resurgence. Some of these reprints feature Blue Bolt episodes from back in his superhero days, and in 1952, the comic was rebranded again to Weird Tales of Terror in hopes of capturing a new audience of horror lovers. To make things even weirder, the Blue Bolt character was totally rebranded himself, now titled Death, Danger, and Deceit, featuring a reprint from the old World War II story arc. As you can imagine, none of these efforts worked, and L.B. finally ditched Blue Bolt entirely, rebranding the publication one final time to Ghostly Weird Stories, but the obsession with the grotesque and occult storylines put the magazine right in the crosshairs of the Comics Code Authority, and the publication was eventually shut down. Today, Blue Bolt is barely remembered, despite its very existence sparking the flame that would eventually become one of the most popular superheroes of all time. If anything, it goes down in history as a bold experiment that could never quite figure out what it wanted to be, where creative directors routinely mismanaged and misjudged what the audience wanted, and therefore always stayed one too many steps behind the competition. Still though, it does have some bright spots here and there. While many of the episodes, especially during the wartime stories, are downright shameful, on occasion it could surprise you, and it's a case study in how the comic world changed through the 40s and early 50s. Because the character is now in the public domain, I think a lot about the creative decisions that I might make with the character. One thing is for certain, having now read every single issue of this series, I've got plenty of examples of what not to do. Squarespace sponsored this video, and if you're a creator, they want to help build you an online home. They make designing a website a breeze. Just select from one of their beautiful templates, and then you can customize it to the way that works best for you. Let's say you want to start a podcast, but you don't want to waste a bunch of time dealing with annoying logistics. Their Audio Blocks feature handles it for you. Maybe you want to build a private community. They offer member areas. Even if you have an idea for a business, they can help you set up your online storefront. You can check it out for free by starting a trial at squarespace.com. If you like the experience, and I think you will, then when you're ready to launch your site in full, head over to squarespace.com/AustinMcConnell to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain.